if we look at fuel modification or fuel treatment options, there's a number of areas that we can work on, and I like to think of it from the back door to the back fence. Is if the householder can look after a circle of safety around the house where there is no fuel, say up to 30 metres, depending on what state you're in, it'll be requested that people manage the fuel in that area, basically limiting any chance of flames reaching the home from a bushfire. And then outside that circle of safety, there's a modified fuel zone as well, where you thin out the fuel. It still is reasonably aesthetically pleasing, but there's not as big a danger from forest fuels that can ignite or throw embers onto structures. So that's usually understood and fairly well done to start with, but often it's the ongoing maintenance of this that causes problems that firefighters discover only at the last minute when they've gone into a suburb to try and defend it. Outside that, other strategies are being used overseas, things like adjacent to communities, you can look to have a fuel modified zone that protects the entire community. Or even further out, when we look at landscape scale burning, where we could have areas of forest that are in fact compartmentised. It's really important overseas because fire will actually kill the forest. So you'll find in places like Spain or the US, they actually want to protect the forest from fire itself because just reasonably moderate temperatures will kill the pine trees that they have as their forest species over there, whereas in Australia our species are much more fire tolerant. In fact, some of them propagate through the flame. So who's responsible? The way emergency services look at it today and how we manage a hazard such as bushfire is we use a PPRR model, which is prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. And you'll notice the response quest quite large in this particular slide, and that's because that's where a lot of energies, or everyone believes that's what we should do. We can't do anything about it prior to that, so the 11th hour we'll all rush up and respond. Well, that's all very well, but of course prevention's better than cure. And we need to look at it before we have to respond, because the realities are we simply cannot respond with enough resources to deal with the problem when we have fire invading the built environment like we do in Australia. The priorities of nearly all agencies is life, property and the environment in that order. So whether it's a land management agency that has firefighters such as forestry or parks, or whether it be the fire service, they are still all their overarching goals are life, property and environment. Now, overseas best practice, emergency services, local governments, developers, householders and foresters, depending on which country, they look at all those areas that I've probably discussed earlier, and how we can work better collectively to make sure the communities are safe. So it's important that we don't get shortcuts that really, I guess, can happen. When developers are willing to do something, they then ask a local government if they could perhaps cut a corner here, or we design something where we want to have a defendable space, but then that's let go, and the householder, when he sells the house, doesn't bother to maintain their property. So the existing problem that's there becomes even worse. Looking at the PPRR model, one thing I think is fairly obvious to me: before we get into managing that risk, we actually have to look at assessing the risk. And then if we identify that we have a bushfire risk, we should then plan accordingly. That is, perhaps not even putting anyone in such a high-risk area that can exist that they would perish if they built their house, say, on the top of the hill in a bushland area. We also have to have legislation in place, and often do, but the realities of enacting that legislation can be quite difficult if agencies or governments are not resourced to do what they're legislatively asked to do or required to do. So what we're really starting to see is a trend towards resilience rather than response. And the federal government some years ago got got really behind this idea of making sure that communities are resilient, and they have offered funding, particularly for bushfire fighting strategies or initiatives, to make sure that we are resilient. And we've tended to try and look at what we might protect, such as our infrastructure and our residents. But it is important to remember that critical infrastructure that keeps the community going is something that we must protect, such as our power infrastructure, our communications infrastructure, our road infrastructure. Really important that we're able to keep the community going, even if they have had a disaster, to minimise the impact of, say, a bushfire disaster. What I have found when I've been away, that risk assessment mapping in California and in some European countries is a very useful tool to identify how bad or how safe an area is. So we'd be looking at a number of factors for risk assessment in regards to bushfires. That would be your fuel load and the vegetation type, the historical fire travel and the frequency of fires that we've had in the past, the topography and the weather, which play a big issue in bushfire once a fire started. And as I mentioned, the critical infrastructure that we want to protect and how we go about that by perhaps mitigating the impact of fire by preparing the ground and dealing with the fuels, and also in the built environment, where the built environment is, where people are at risk if they live adjacent to or near or in a bushfire-prone area. In France, for example, if you look at this slide, they are doing things where they are zoning the bushfire risk, and they have got to the point where they are saying to local government, we do not want you to build or allow building to occur in areas of very high risk from bushfire. And then there'd be another area where, let's say if we have a look at this example here, where we've got the yellow zone, we wouldn't want people building on the hills where a bushfire can race up and hit them, and then we also want them in the blue zones to be away from the edge of a hill where a fire may come up and invade the house or the built area. Now, in some cases, we might say, well, you can build in a location, but we want you to modify the fuels in that area. We want you to have different building codes, and of course, there's some variables in there that can be allowed and are allowed in France itself. Mapping the fire zone can be done in other ways. Here's a simple map that was done in Italy. It took one man 1 year to just look at the levels of fuel and the slope that abutted the built environment, and they came up with a map like we're looking at now that indicates that if there's fires in certain areas, then it's only a moderate problem. If it's in the red areas, then it's a high risk area. Now that can be used to help firefighters know how to respond, how to where they could prioritise their fuel modification programs or their burning programs, or local governments can use this to inform their fire prevention programs and their burn programs. We have to look at managing the current development. That's probably our biggest problem because it's already there and we have to deal with it in retrospect. But so planning for the future should be fairly straightforward, and I think that there's some huge advantages if town planners can look at the layout and understand that there are hazards that can be easily mitigated just by simply designing the place better, so that you may have a perimeter road that you use that gives you further space around structures that lessens the risk of attack by bushfire. Let's have a look at some key preparedness strategies or some key initiatives perhaps that are used overseas. I went to Ventura County, and in that location there's a close relationship between local government and the fire service, and the Ventura County Fire Chief reports to the Mayor. Well, what they have in place here to look at retrospectively maintaining low fuel loads is an abatement arrangement where the firefighters will go and inspect the areas, and if someone requires their risk to be abated, then they'll be told. If they do not do it, then the local government will do it on their behalf. They will charge them the cost of doing the abatement, And they'll also, in this case, they charge them an additional fee of $635. Or they did at that time. It may have even gone up now. What I found when I spoke to the fire chief there was that they may have inspected some 3,000 residences that year and only needed to do this, I think it was 7 times. So that was really working. People were taking notice and they were looking after their fuel loads in and around their homes. That's for private residences. It is important that we do know what our urban interface hazard is, so that, as I mentioned earlier, we can target community education programs, look at our hazard reduction strategies, and burn programs that we might have at local government, and for us to prepare our responses for our agencies. The other factor that is looked at in California, I think it was in late 2007, they introduced better building codes for those urban interface areas, what they call the wildland urban interface, where they have double glazing, for example, or they have different rules about what sort of roofing materials used or not, given that in the US there is often wooden roofs as well. So different standards to make the structures essentially harder to ignite should they be attacked by embers. In Santa Barbara, for example, the sorts of standards that they're expecting of a householder is illustrated here by a couple of before and after photographs. Here is a before photograph of the fuel risk around a home, and here's what's expected, the standard after. Now that could be quite horrendous for some people, but what I've been told is that after a couple of years, people become quite used to what we see here. It might be an initial shock, but they become accustomed to having that level of foliage around their home. But of course there's some that just can't be protected, like this one, which is in the San Bernardino Valley, and you'll even look at this slide, you'll see houses up the hills as we go in the background of that slide. But this is a town in the middle of that fine forest. There is no defendable space there, so what they're looking to do is compartmentalise the forest so that they can actually have a chance of extinguishing the fire in the forest. What's happened here is they've used a mechanical mulcher to go through and thin out the vegetation, remove some trees so that the canopy is 60% or less, the roof canopy. The ladder fuels, that is the twigs and the like that come out of the pine tree at the base, can allow a vertical travel of fire from the ground. They remove that and then they just mulch it up and leave it on the ground like we do with bark and the like. So that gives an area where the fire will not be intense and firefighters have a chance of controlling it. Another way or another approach is by this example in France, where along the lee side of where an expected bushfire will come from, there's a modified fuel zone in a cleared area where, again, firefighters have a chance of being able to stop the fire front as such coming over the hill. Won't stop the embers, but there is a chance of arresting the overall bushfire when you have something in place like this. So if I look at what's the total solution package, well really we want to keep flames away from houses. That's that circle of safety in those fuel modified zones, compartmenting the forest, etc. I've spoken of. Make houses hard to catch alight. That is with building codes, better building codes, or a combination of the above. Then we need to get our emergency services organised so they do a rapid initial attack, concentrated attack to stop the fire spreading. So we find that aircraft and firefighters on the ground in that first 30 minutes, if they can stop the fire, then we haven't got a problem at all. Then if it moves into a more sustained phase, that's when it becomes chaotic and complex, and we have to be ready to look at that. That was really the essence of my study. The next element, of course, is we must have community support and help if we've got to manage the ongoing risk or the existing risk or hazard that we have at the moment. So that's the result I'd like to see when I look at a house after a fire. It's in this slide where we can see that that house has survived, and so is this little orchard, because there's been defendable space around it. We've been able to get in there. Firefighters have been able to save that home and maintain their own safety during the firefighting.